Hi, Simon. Welcome to the Creative Operation podcast by Artwork Flow. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners and our community?
Thank you. Yes, my name is Simon Everett. I'm currently a creative operations consultant, but I've been working in the creative industry for over 35 years now, starting in a studio, varying different roles from very traditional background through to what is obviously a largely technology-driven industry.
So Simon, as you mentioned, you have 35 years spent in the creative industry, and I don't think creative operations as a term or as a department existed when you started. So why don't you walk us through, what were some of your formative roles? What did creative operations look back 20 years ago, if you look back, and how has it evolved over the last 2 to 3 decades that you've been working in the industry?
Sure. Well, I was kind of lucky and unlucky at the very beginning as a newbie in the industry. My boss went on holiday he went on honeymoon for 3 weeks, and the two guys, I was a senior guy to me, and we were basically given the keys to the business, and I was told that I had to answer the phone, talk to clients, deal with suppliers, and the management of the company. So in a way, that was my first foray into running a creative operation. But the real kind of breakthrough for me came in the early noughties, when I was working in an agency, Banner Corporation, and I had the opportunity to make a decision whether I wanted to set up a studio, to go into art direction or go into creative direction. Okay. And my decision was to set creative studio up, because that's where I felt I was more confident, and it was like a gut feeling. That's where I felt my real skill set lay. Thankfully, my boss at the time said that was the right decision, because he thought that was my strength as well. So that was the first opportunity I had to actually set something up from scratch, putting a team together, putting processes together, workflows, setting up supplier relationships, and just delivering the job that I knew I had to do, and being given direction from the boss as well. So that was the first kind of real foray into operations, where I wasn't just responsible for doing a job myself, because I had my day-to-day job, but I actually had to make sure everything worked, and that included the IT side, communication side. So I was very lucky that I was kind of given the opportunity to go in the direction where I kind of felt, was where my strength was.
Right. So you've worked with, brands across the board, different industries that you've worked. So how would you describe that? What is the kind of transformation, that previously inefficient creative processes and, now with tools and technology, how do you bring efficiency into, these various kind of industries that you work with in the context of creative operations? Like, you can describe it broadly, and then maybe we can get into specifics of a couple of such things.
Yeah, the way creative operations has evolved is, obviously the technology. Originally there wasn't much technology, but as things evolved, whether it was, we went from a traditional workflow to a PDF delivery workflow, sending files down the telephone line. Then there was the automated workflow, so you could just push Command P, and not only would it print something for you, it would file it, it would, color manage it for you. And so the evolution of technology has allowed creative operations to not just increase their efficiency, but also their capabilities as well. Again, in the early days, to have a team who were just focused on print, all of a sudden you've got the digital content that needs to be supplied. That digital content was a combination of static and animation and video. All of a sudden you needed the technology to help you deliver animated content. Then there was, automation, resizing, dynamic content, driven from a database. What technology has given us is to be able to do more
Hmm.
with the same or with less
Hmm.
people. And from doing things repetitively, those boring jobs like saving PDFs into the right location or sending them to the right printer, that's stuff that your team generally don't want to do. So if you create an automation process to allow them to do that, they just hit one button and it goes off, and they can get on and be more creative, do work that they're more interested in. No one likes doing the boring, repetitive stuff. So technology's made those types of roles not so much redundant. They've taken the mundane stuff out the way, because it ensures consistency for a start, if nothing else. And it then allows your own team to develop their skills and expertise in roles where they potentially want to go. And that includes things like video, animation, as well as just kind of resizing, or maybe it's a little bit more design rather than just being an art worker in some respects. So that's where I think the technology, and it's going exponentially now. The AI, where can that take us? It's still, I don't think a lot of people know where it's going to take us, but it's worth investigating if nothing else, because again, if it can make us more efficient, if it can make a better product, if it can mean that we can make it more efficiently and sell it cheaper to our clients, they're happier. But there's also that level of, how far does it go? Does it take jobs, for instance? I'm hoping it won't be. I think what, if anything, it will do, it will, like other industrial revolutions of the past, it will create different types of jobs.
Absolutely.
And the boring stuff will just get set aside.
Absolutely. So I think, from various chats that I've been having on this podcast, and, we've been talking about how AI can be more of a co-pilot for the creative industry rather than, being the industry itself. There's a lot more of creativity that can be explored once all of the mundane tasks are taken out of the picture. So now, coming back to your experiences, any particular project or any particular implementation that you did in your across your career, could be a recent one, could be an old one as well, that you thought was a very transformative project? And I ask this because we have had conversations with creative ops professionals where they have mentioned that there isn't a lot of content out there for them to learn from. So why don't you walk me through one of your projects? You don't have to
I
take a name or anything, just like what was the problem statement, how you solved it, and go about it.
Yeah, it's a very simple project that I've got in mind, and it's a very recent project. I was asked by a CRM agency
Mm-hmm.
to come in and help them build a creative process because they didn't have one.
Okay.
And what this meant was that the creative team weren't working in a consistent way. There was no control, and kind of more importantly, there was a lack of trust from the other teams on the
Mm-hmm.
creative team because there was no control. There was no consistent way of working. So I came in and I did a discovery phase with the agency. So I spoke not just to the creative team, but the project management, account management, delivery, strategy, IT, and kind of got a picture of what the problems were from their perspective, not from the creative perspective alone, but from their perspective. And what came out of that was a consistency issue. There was no brief, there was no formal way of booking work in. And the big thing was the head of creative, who was an incredibly talented, very knowledgeable person in the CRM space. He knew a lot of technologies, a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
He was a bottleneck. He was the problem in many ways. He took on too much. And by taking on too much meant he didn't get work done, which meant he let down people. So from all this information, I drew out the main problems, presented it to the management team. And on top of that, drew out a very simple process. They had 3 phases: concepting, design, and then HTML build.
Mm-hmm.
And just said, okay, look, these are the phases of your projects. All we need to do is put steps within each phase and build in the roles and responsibilities. So you have a briefing process which kickstarts. This is all in theory, by the way. The briefing process kickstarts the project. The brief then helps book that project in, timings are agreed, and then you allocate the tasks within the process to the individual. So if there's a guy who's coming up with concepts and ideas, you brief that in. You tell him when you need it. You then have an approval process. And when everything's approved, you go to the design stage. Again, that's booked in with an individual in the design team. They have a deadline to work to. They have a approval process to work to. And then when that's approved, it goes through to the next phase, and so on. And when I proposed the workflow, in principle, everyone thought it was great. But obviously there was some concerns about, okay, how does it work? They had a workflow, very simple workflow tool that they were using, but they weren't, again, using it for all clients. They weren't using it properly. They were using a free version of it as well, which didn't help. So I proposed that they buy some licenses that freed up more, functionality for the technology. And we effectively built their process in this workflow tool. The tool itself was Trello, which is a relatively simple tool. There was familiarity there. So people, when you introduce new technology, the lead time's a lot longer. So because there was a bit of a time was of the essence for me to get this up and running, it's use what was familiar. So majority of people knew Trello, they accepted it. And then what we did is simply build nice little automations. So when one task was effectively completed, the person pushed a little button, say it's complete. It would automatically move it to the next task and notify the person who's in charge of that task. There you go. So at any one time, the knock-on effect was at any one time, anyone in the team, not just the creative team, project management, account management, delivery, could go and see exactly where all the projects that were booked into creative were at, who they were with, what the deadlines were, and if there were any issues, they would have chats within each of those projects. So the project they used a Kanban style approach. So you had a project, and that project literally moved from stage to stage on the Kanban chart.
Correct.
And it wasn't rocket science. But what made it work was it was simple and it was clear, and it meant that everything did the same. It was all the same process. If there wasn't a need for design, it was just an HTML build, that's fine. You put the project straight into HTML, but the process itself still required approval. It's still, everyone knew where it stood. So that for me was a really good, and they gave me a recommendation on LinkedIn as well, which was lovely. But that was a really nice, simple project whereby you just took something that was chaotic and gave it some order, and faith in the creative team was restored. The head of creative has now got his workload properly managed. He's been able to delegate some of the approvals that he was taking on to some of his senior team. So it helps the senior team then develop their skills and their progression. If you don't give people the chance to grow in their jobs and they just live with frustration, they will leave. Simple as that. If you've got a happy team that are being given opportunities to develop skills, experiences, etc., then the team as a whole becomes a better team, and then the other departments think, what a great team you are. It's simple. But and also as a final thing, the process isn't set in stone. As things develop, as needs change, there's always an opportunity to tweak the process, add things, take things away. I'm a firm believer in get it started, see how it works, and when things don't work, you change it. You don't try and get everything perfect before you start. You move things forward, and then they haven't come back to me and said it's not working anymore, Simon. So hopefully it's all okay.
That's interesting. And so, I want to dive a little bit deeper into this particular project. So, for example, you designed everything, you did the strategy, you built the Trello boards, you built the entire process. Then, getting their team to use it, or the implementation part that we call, or the
Hmm.
product adoption part, right? How do you
Yeah.
go about that? Like, how did you go about making sure that they're using the process and the boards that you build for them?
Well, firstly, you build in time to train the team up. You make sure that you set the system up so everyone has the correct level of access. So
Right.
if they are a designer and your system requires the type of account they have to be a design account, you make sure everything. So you get everything in place. And then you
Right.
go through that training session. And we did it team by team. We trained up the creative team. We made sure that the existing projects were put into the new system and everything was like sorted out in that respect. So it wasn't a case of we had two systems running, everything was moved across. You then go through with the other teams, and we know project management, account management was probably the most challenging because they all had their own clients. So we had to make sure that we trained them up and then they could do that training in relation to the way they work with their clients, because
Hmm.
different clients have slightly different ways of working, and one particular client wanted access to the inner workings of the creative team, which again I challenged the team on, was why is a client seeing how you guys are working that you shouldn't give client access to your back room, because when you don't want people to know you've got problems or issues or mistakes happening, you
Hmm.
just deliver to the client.
Right.
But we had a period of, once we launched, and we did have a launch day, is once we launched, I was then focused on seeing how those projects were going through, being on hand to answer questions like, oh, how does this briefing work again? How do I do? It's familiarity. You get everyone working on the system, because if you
Hmm.
train someone to do something and they don't do it for a week, they'll forget how they've done it. It's like any training. So we did the training literally, we'd already launched the system. So it's almost like live. We actually did a live briefing project with each of the teams. So they could actually then see their part of the process actually in action. And we just then monitored it. And when people had a problem, again, we could solve it. If there were any particular issues, we also had a spreadsheet for recording particular issues, because there are some issues you couldn't solve. Or they may have come up with a suggestion. Oh, can we do this, please? Is there any way we can attach a file and send that on to the client? And you would put these requests into a spreadsheet, I should say. And that was for the head of creative to then review every month to say, okay, are there some features we can add here that make it a better process? But implementing it was, you have to, as soon as you implement it, you have to have that time to make sure that you support the team. And it wasn't just me, it was the whole creative team knew the process inside out. So anyone in the creative team could help the team, but also we had champions in each of the other teams. So there was a champion in account management, project management. So from their perspective, there was a go-to person in their team who could also solve some of those problems or put those requests in if they thought there was a request needed.
Great. So, coming to the budgeting side of it, and managing so many different stakeholders. So, and you manage a lot of projects at scale. How do you decide, or how do you keep yourself within budget, and how do you allocate resources between internal, external vendors, agencies, and do you have like a qualification process for the same as well?
Going back to my days when I was head of creative studio at Hayes as part of the marketing there, it came down to planning. So as a creative studio, I needed to know what was coming down the line, the types of projects, the skills that were required. And depending on the business, because obviously we work with 22 different business sectors in the company. So there was an accountancy and finance business, there was a education business, an IT business, all of whom had their own recruitment. It was a recruitment business. They had their own recruitment requirements, their own marketing plans to increase their businesses. Some of them had budget, some of them didn't. So there was also a priority, because from a business perspective in the UK, I was well aware of the business plan to promote the 5 key industries, which was engineering, healthcare, education, IT and technology, and HR. They were the priority businesses. So when the projects were beginning to appear, you knew what you could prioritize and you knew what you couldn't prioritize. I would also then talk to the marketing manager as well as the business stakeholder and say, okay, well, what kind of budget do you have? Because that will depend on what we can deliver for you. And invariably, we work with very tight budgets. But there were certain projects that were flagship projects. So the salary guide, every year we produced a salary guide. And we knew when it was coming. And, I always booked a freelancer in because it was one of those projects. They didn't work on anything else. There was this one big project. We had a deadline. That deadline was a hard deadline, could not move. But I had a very experienced freelancer who I worked with for many years, trusted him. He knew how we worked. So I could book him well in advance and make sure that I had the budget ready for him in that respect. With the other stakeholders, the other businesses, it really came down to how well were they working to their marketing plans. Because quite often when you work in an in-house environment, someone will come up with an idea, an opportunity to present at an event or to sponsor a local business guild. And it did become a challenge at times, but generally speaking, it depended on what was required. If there was a need for better looking content, so animated content or video content, if your team don't have that capability, then you need to look to get that freelance talent in. If it's a bigger project and you're working with an agency, you just need to make sure that, again, there's that, what is the budget that we've got? And then you build that brief and you brief that agency in to work, here's our budget, what can you produce for that budget? And on top of just budgeting and resourcing, it's also any sort of resource, external resource, needs management. Whether it's an agency or freelance, you have to manage them. And that's another thing that can often decide whether or not you do bring a freelancer in, because sometimes on some of these projects, actually, it's going to take you longer to brief somebody in if it's urgent than just to give your team, actually, we need to fit this job in, guys. Let's get it in. And they all understood that, if we get external resources in, it's a cost that comes off your bottom line.
Yeah.
So if it means, we're spending less money, then quite often, if you've got a good team behind you, they say, no, we can take that on ourselves. But obviously, the other thing is to, set up your capability, your training programs to make sure that your team are more capable of producing more and better and more sophisticated work as well. So you're less reliant. And then the freelancing side becomes, and the agency side becomes really a matter of delivering something that you just need to deliver because you don't have enough time. You're maxed out.
Got it. Interesting. So to summarize, you would say 2 core things, which is one is the priorities of the overall business in terms of goals and industries, and second one would be the capabilities that you have internally, capabilities and bandwidth basically, versus how much you want to outsource.
And having that vision, that's why the workflow tools that, project management tools are so important. If you can see what your team are working on, you can see. And even better, if you can provide data to your boss to say, this is how busy my team are. If they're working at 80% capacity or 90% capacity, where I've worked in the past, you've got evidence to say, I need some resource. Because obviously, a lot of people, I've worked for some tough bosses who said, why can't the team cope with it? Why don't you just give them more and tell them to work later? Well, it doesn't. Everyone working late all the time doesn't work, make for a good environment. So you have to have that evidence to say this is how busy we are. So having sort of project management, using a system like that rather than working off a spreadsheet, which I've had to do in the past, it gives you that evidence to say, look, this is and time recording as well. So you can see what time's being recorded. So it gives you that evidence to say, we're at maxed out. We need this help if you want to deliver this campaign.
Yeah, Got it. Interesting. So I think we are pretty much at the end of this conversation. I didn't realize, how time passed with your
It goes
stories.
quick, yeah.
I do have a few, rapid fire kind of questions,
Hmm.
which are more on the fun side. So let's get on with them. So, Simon, if there was one task in the entire creative operation gamut that you absolutely hate and would like a machine to do it for you, what would that be?
One thing I really hated doing, the year-end reviews were always a challenge for me because I tried to do it on a regular basis, but quite often getting that time with your team, I didn't hate it. It became because it was more the responsibility I felt for doing it to make sure that your team were on track to do what you wanted them to do. So it wasn't so much I hated it. I felt the burden of responsibility because I knew how important it was, and also to kind of make sure you've got the objectives in place, that you are managing those objectives, they are fully aware and they're on track, because it can sometimes lead to some very hard conversations. There is one other thing, is when mistakes happen. I that was kind of having to spend the entire time working out how this mistake happened, and having to report that to your managing director or your marketing director. That was always tough, because it was always a case of, I could do without this. You hated the fact that you'd made a mistake. You hated the fact that you'd let your team down. As a team, let the wider team down. You hated the fact that maybe you've cost the company money, and you've also, as a team leader, is how you're then perceived by your boss, and that's the most important thing. That in the boss, sometimes these mistakes happen because something breaks, but sometimes they happen and you don't know why they happen, and you struggle to work out how they've happened, and you've got to work out how you tell the boss. So that was another aspect that I hated as well. But no one likes making mistakes, to be honest.
Funnily enough, these are the two things that I don't think can be automated by a machine. There's a
No,
huge human angle to giving feedback, and I hope
one
not.
day maybe you can ask
I hope
AI,
not.
what the hell happened, AI,
But
and
never
they
say
go and
never.
find out.
Yeah, you
You
never
know,
know. Got it. Very interesting. If you had a time machine, where or which period would you go back to?
what, even in my lifetime or any time?
Anytime.
I'd like to go back to the 60s, because it was a real explosion of discovery, for everything. Music changed, fashion changed, business changed, and also, I come from a time when technology didn't rule our lives. And there's also a nice, sometimes you can think back on your early adulthood and think, how did we get from London to Edinburgh back then without Google Maps or the train lines on a mobile
How
device?
did
But I
you
think
know?
the 60s for me, I think, was always a real fun discovery decade, where everything just kind of became possible. It became colourful, and from the dark days of the 40s and the 50s, the 60s really kind of exploded.
Interesting. So I think that brings us to the end of our conversation, Simon. It was really nice having you on the Art Workflow podcast, and thanks again for
Thank you.
taking out the time. And I'm really, impressed by the energy and passion that you still have after working for so many years in the industry. So kudos to that, and all the
No,
best for
thank
your
you. And
course.
honestly, I've been very lucky to work in an industry that I love, simple as that, so thank you for having me.